This is what a British Sunday actually felt like in the 1960s, back when Sunday observance laws turned the entire country into something stranger than fiction, a day when you could legally buy pornographic magazines, but not a Bible, when a fish and chip shop could sell you anything except fish and chips, when an exhibition of bees was banned as illegal entertainment, and when the entire country simply stopped. If you grew up in Britain during the 1960s, you already know exactly what I'm talking about. And if you did not, you are not going to believe half of what I'm about to tell you. The first thing that hit you on a Sunday morning was the quiet. Not just ordinary quiet, a different kind of quiet. The streets were empty, the shops were shuttered, no delivery vans, no market traders shouting, no buses running their full routes. You would step outside and hear bird song in the middle of a city, the odd church bell in the distance, maybe a dog barking somewhere down the road. Britain on a Sunday morning in the 1960s sounded like someone had turned the volume down on the entire country. And there was a reason for that. Britain wasn't just traditionally quiet on Sundays, it was quiet by law. Layers and layers of Sunday observance laws, going all the way back to 1625. The Sunday Observance Act of 1677 made it technically illegal to work on a Sunday at all, except in emergencies. The Sunday Observance Act of 1781, pushed through Parliament almost single-handedly by one determined bishop called Bailby Porteous, closed not just theatres and taverns, but libraries, museums, zoos, and public gardens. For over 150 years, that one piece of legislation shaped what an entire nation could and couldn't do for 1/7 of its life. And by the 1960s, the patchwork of rules that had built up over the centuries had reached something close to the absurd. The 1950 Shops Act was the big one, governing what could and couldn't be sold, and the exceptions were genuinely bewildering. You could buy fruit and vegetables on a Sunday, but not if they were tinned. You could buy razor blades, but only for medicinal purposes, like removing corns, not for shaving. Cigarettes and ice cream were perfectly fine, but frozen vegetables or fish fingers would land you in trouble. A postcard was no problem at all, but sell someone a birthday card and you were looking at a fine of several £100. Fresh cream was legal, evaporated milk was against the law. And then there was the famous fish and chip paradox. A fish and chip shop was legally prohibited from selling fish and chips on a Sunday, but a Chinese takeaway or any other kind of food shop could sell as much fish and as many chips as they liked, provided, of course, that they were not technically a fish and chip shop. A judge called Mr. Justice Humphreys looked at all these exceptions once and said there was almost no nonsensical proposition which could not seriously be put forward as a result of reading them. He was absolutely right. The situation was so obviously broken that by the early 1960s, a government body called the Craythorne Committee had been set up specifically to investigate the anomalies in the Shops Act, and even they struggled to recommend a clean solution. Behind all of this stood the Lord's Day Observance Society, founded in 1831 by brothers Joseph Wilson and Daniel Wilson, Joseph a wealthy merchant, Daniel a prominent evangelical, and they were extraordinarily powerful and extraordinarily determined. Every year the town of Dagenham held a show on Saturday and Sunday. One year, someone proposed including an exhibition by amateur beekeepers on the Sunday. The Lord's Day Observance Society found out, wrote to the town clerk, and pointed out that an exhibition of bees constituted a form of entertainment not permitted under the Sunday Entertainments Act of 1932. That was the same act that had allowed cinemas to open on Sundays, but it drew the line at bees, apparently. The episode was later documented in Parliament by Member of Parliament John Parker, which tells you something about how seriously people took all this. The beekeepers were dropped from the program. The society even took legal opinion on whether they could find a way to ban television on Sundays. If they could have done it, they would have. But what did people actually do? The day had a very specific rhythm that millions of families followed almost identically. You got up, maybe a bit later than a weekday. Someone went out to fetch the Sunday papers. The house smelled of toast and tea. If you were part of the 12 or so percent of adults still attending church regularly by the mid-60s, down from nearly 16% just 7 years earlier, you got yourself dressed and walked to the service. The Roman Catholics were actually growing during this period, peaking in the 60s, but overall the pews were getting emptier. Church or not, the centerpiece of Sunday was the roast. Those of you who remember the smell of a Sunday roast in the oven, the fat crackling, the gravy starting to form, will know exactly what I mean. The biggest dinner of the week, always on a Sunday, a tradition stretching back to 1485, when Henry VII's royal guards earned the nickname beef eaters for the quantities of roast beef they consumed. By the Industrial Revolution, families had worked out the perfect system. Put the joint in the oven before church, add the vegetables, and come home to a dinner that was practically ready. In the 1960s, this tradition was at its absolute peak. Roast chicken or a joint of beef or pork, 3 fresh vegetables, mashed or roast potatoes, proper gravy, the works. Then came the aftermath. The entire family would retire to the living room, too stuffed into semi-comatosity to argue with each other, and slump in front of the television. Maybe an Ealing comedy flickering away on the black and white set. Maybe a box of Quality Street getting passed around. You might stay awake for the whole film, then again, you might not. If you fancied a drink, the pub opened at 12 and shut firmly at 2, then nothing. A 5-hour gap that seemed to stretch into eternity before the doors opened again at 7. And even then, last orders came at 10:30. That was in England, mind you. If you happened to be in Wales, you were completely out of luck. The Sunday Closing Act of 1881 banned every public house in Wales from opening on a Sunday at all. Private members' clubs could set their own hours, which tells you everything about who actually went thirsty and who did not. As one person memorably put it, they went to Wales once on a Sunday in the early 70s, and unfortunately it was closed. They have not been back since. Scotland, by the way, had never had Sunday trading restrictions at all, a fact that would become increasingly awkward to explain as the decades wore on, and English retailers watched their Scottish counterparts trading freely 7 days a week without the sky falling in. For entertainment, your options were limited. The cinema was open. That had been allowed since the Sunday Entertainments Act of 1932. Television offered a few hours of programming, and Sunday night at the London Palladium was the big one, an ATV variety show hosted by Bruce Forsyth that pulled in over 20 million viewers. 20 million people watching the same thing at the same time because there was not much else to watch and nowhere else to go. But here is the thing that is hardest to explain to anyone who was not there. It was not really boring. That is what people always assume. And it was not quite right. The slower pace was a collective discipline. Everyone was doing the same nothing together. It was not that something was preventing you from sitting still, it was that nobody else was doing much either. The parks were full of families on afternoon walks. Kids kicked footballs around. People visited relatives. You read the paper cover to cover because you actually had the time. There was a genuine peacefulness to it that you did not fully appreciate until it was gone. The laws started crumbling eventually. Theaters weren't fully legal on Sundays until 1972. Pubs couldn't open all day until 1988. The push for proper Sunday trading reform reached a crisis point in the mid-80s, with 2 broad camps forming. On one side, retailers and consumer groups who wanted full deregulation. On the other, a coalition called Keep Sunday Special, backed by the churches, trade unions, and a significant chunk of the Conservative Party, who argued that removing restrictions would destroy a day that still had genuine social value. Keep Sunday Special were effective enough that when a Sunday trading bill came before Parliament in 1986, 72 Conservative members of Parliament rebelled against their own government, the only time Margaret Thatcher ever lost an entire bill. The shop workers' union, USDAW, was also central to the eventual compromise, pushing hard to ensure that if Sunday trading was coming, workers would have the right to refuse Sunday shifts. It took until 1994 for the Sunday Trading Act to finally dismantle most of the restrictions, with those worker protections included as part of the deal. As one government official noted when England was still arguing about it, the world had not come to an end north of the border. Those 60s Sundays belonged to a Britain that genuinely believed a nation needed one day a week where it collectively exhaled, where you bought your paper, ate your roast, dozed through a film, and let the hours drift past without guilt. The quiet wasn't emptiness, it was permission to stop. If you remember those Sundays, you remember a country that doesn't quite exist anymore. And if this brought back a few memories, drop them in the comments. I would love to hear what your Sundays look like.